Alright, here I go, going late to the game on a review that a lot of other people have already talked about. Go me. I'm going to be honest, I really didn't like this anime, just because it had way too many problems. And as for those problems, they are problems with the fundamentals of the story, not minor nitpicks. I know this is a popular anime, so if it makes you feel any better, I really did try to like this. I mean, the premise was fairly unique and it could have lent itself to being a really good anime, well, if, to be honest, they did everything else differently. There were way too many characters who had no depth or complexity to them at all. The protagonist was bland and generic. The villains felt mostly like they were written by a 6-year-old. The plot had way too much exposition and didn't leave itself to any good interest whatsoever. Basically, this anime was a giant disappointment for me. Now, like I've said numerous times in the past, the characters are easily the most important part of any anime, but the characters of Akame ga Kill aren't anything more than generic cardboard cutouts. So here's your basic summary of the show. The anime starts off with the protagonist Tatsumi wanting to join the capital's army, and after arriving at the capital and losing his money, he ends up staying with a higher-up family. While staying with them, he runs into a group of assassins called Night Raid who are fighting against the capital. And then after learning about the dark nature of the capital, he ends up joining Night Raid. Let's start out with Tatsumi, who is yet again another generic protagonist. Yay. If you watched my review of The Fruit of Grisaya, you would have known that I gave a description of the generic anime protagonist. I said that the generic anime protagonist has no definable traits whatsoever, is just a nice guy because he's a nice guy, he's dense, and some of the time somewhat perverted. I must have been a psychic because I gave a pretty spot-on description of Tatsumi, even though at that point I hadn't watched the show. Wow, it's like I've seen this somewhere before. His only motivation is basically just because he is quote-unquote good. They try to give him motivation, but it's so half-hearted it's laughable, which is because of the death of his close friends. The first major problem they have is they try to kill off the friends and try to make a really big deal about it, even though we legitimately didn't even have an introduction to who they are. While yes, the death was dark, just being dark isn't automatically meaningful. I know this is kind of sad when you think about it, but there's no way you can expect us to have emotion about characters we don't even know at all. They try to fix this by just throwing around flashbacks every now and then about them, but they are always so fast and show so very little that I can't remember anything about them. Heck, I don't even remember what these characters we're supposed to be so concerned about even looked like. It was so fast, so rushed over, and didn't show any good reason to care. Alright guys, listen, the right way to do this is step 1, develop the character and give reasons for us to care about them. This would make the big scene when you actually kill him off actually be meaningful because they're about characters we would actually care about and actually know. The result of this sloppy screenwriting is a bad setup and a bland character who has no justification for his motivation. And because of this doesn't really give a strong sense of why he would actually join this assassins group. It's basically just for reasons we don't know, because he cares about characters that we don't know and we're supposed to care about that. Moving on to the next part of my explanation of the generic main character is being dense, and he takes that to a whole new level. This is bad because it makes him look stupid and unrelatable. Yeah, all those times when Tatsumi thinks, "Oh, it's early in the morning and I'm told to wake up one of my female comrades up. I'll just walk in without knocking because what could possibly go wrong?" Or, "Sure man, I'll listen to you. I'll sneak up to that girl who's bathing for revenge because what could possibly go wrong?" Or my personal favorite when he tries to get one of the higher-ups of the capital to drop everything they worked for and just do a 180 on their ideals. And just because they liked him. While at the same time, there's a very high probability of him saying this will just get him killed. Oh, and get this. He almost ends up asking a second time before he finally gets it through his head that perhaps the person who has slaughtered thousands of people for their cause isn't going to join you. Yeah, perhaps while you're at it, you go ask Hitler very nicely, perhaps you'd like to convert to Judaism. What could possibly go wrong? This is bad because it makes Tatsumi look really stupid and then unrelatable, since any normal person would know that's a bad idea. And there's no reason why we would think that he would think that this is a good idea, rather than again because he's quote-unquote good and quote-unquote innocent. Main characters need to have relatable traits and have reasons to stand behind them, but Tatsumi has scenes that make him look like an idiot and make him look completely unrelatable. And as for definable traits and perhaps any character development, there are none. Despite going from a normalist kid to living with assassins, they never really show him changing at all. Furthermore, he doesn't have any traits that make him stand out at all. No development, no properly constructed motivation, no interest in his past, no traits that would separate him from the sea of other generic protagonists. And with him lacking any definable traits, you also have scenes that make him feel dumb and unrelatable. Basically, Tatsumi is everything I hate about a generic main character in anime. But unfortunately, he isn't the only generic one. While the other characters aren't the type of bad that a little piece of you dies every time you see them, the main problem is the anime falls really hard into the trap of having way too many characters who are absolutely bland.
Too many cooks, too many cooks.
No, we're not doing that. I still have some originality. They are all really just basic archetypes without any serious depth put into them. For instance, there's the tsundere, the epic leader, the quiet one, etc. and so on. Not that any of these archetypes are automatically bad, but what makes them work is well thought out motivation, development, relatability, and or traits that don't make them feel generic. But these characters don't have a single moment that I vividly remember and just say, man, that made them stand out, or wow, that really stuck with me. Yuki Nagato from the Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya was a great quiet character, because of the small amounts of humanity they did show, and the logical approach they took with her in the movie. Levi from Attack on Titan was a great leader, because of his contrasting coolness, subtle emotions, and wise advice. Shana from Shakugan no Shana was a great quote-unquote tsundere because of her great developing personality and great romance that intertwines with that. To the anime's credit, it did try to give them a backstory, that would in turn give them motivation and relatability, but unfortunately that too is another problem with this anime. If you watch my other videos, you'd know that I called Black Bullet the worst case of telling instead of showing. While for Akame ga Kill, it's the biggest expositionaholic I have ever seen. A smart show knows how to use exposition without it feeling forced, while at the same time not relying on it completely. While the problem with Akame ga Kill is pretty much literally everything is told through exposition. And it is the most forced and glaring exposition that I have ever seen. They use exposition for anything you could possibly think of, from flashbacks, the plot, setup, villain flashbacks, and even just how the characters are feeling. What is better, a character explaining their past, or us seeing it as if we were standing right beside them? To say they are using this as a writing crutch is an understatement, which really hurts all other parts of the show, from the plot to the characters, making them all seem flat and uninteresting. And nowhere is this more well demonstrated as the extremely forced backstories, which is the only attempt they really had to try to develop the character. First of all, the backstories had very poor timing, and there really wasn't any build-up for them, or any emotional anticipation for them either. Or in other words, 1 second Tatsumi is on a ship looking for the people he's going to assassinate. Then out of nowhere, bro. No, sorry, not that one. Goes off on his backstory out of nowhere. Guys, if you just jump your tone around like this, it's going to hurt your pacing. Second is the huge forced exposition with all the problems I mentioned before. And I'm not exaggerating by saying that almost all the backstories were completely exposition. One of them not being completely exposition. If that's not a writing crutch, I don't know what is. Next, the backstories are extremely short and only have time to explain what has happened. They don't give a thorough explanation for us to care about the character, they don't give a thorough explanation to the character's motivation, and they don't give a thorough explanation to the reason why. Not to mention, none of them do anything that is really unique or special. The end result of this is a complete mess of a completely forced and a completely forgettable attempt to try to give them motivation and to try to give depth to their characters, who ultimately ended up being completely bland. And like I said before, what amplifies this problem so much more is there are way too many of them, and this makes it even harder to have anything that is rememberable about them. And as for the villains, they're even worse, who are just a complete rocket-propelled train wreck. I'm not kidding when I'm saying these are some of the worst villains I've ever seen. They were nothing more than just being generic, bland, forced, and simple-minded villains. And like the characters, the villains fall into the trap of having way too many of them. which just makes it even harder to try to remember them, let alone leave an impact. For the most part, every time they were on screen, a small part of me died. Let's start off with the first archetype that I'm really sick of saying, which is the evil rich guy who's just evil and just loves money and power because he's evil, of course. Kill me now. Here we go again. I really hate this archetype because it's so simple-minded. Being the main problem with these guys yet again is that they never give them any motivation for their actions besides they love money because, well, they're evil, of course. There really is no excuse not to show motivation because it is kind of the foundation of a character. Moving on to my next point, let's look at this guy, who is so subtle that he constantly talks like someone has permanently lodged a pound of mutton in his throat.
誰でも年頃になると異性を欲しくなるものです。ですが将軍は戦うために持たれてきたような人間です。今の
On that note, let's talk about subtlety and relatability, which is another thing he and a lot of the other villains lack. A second major problem with a lot of the villains is they had a lack of subtlety. Subtlety is the difference between deep and well thought out and simple and childish. Here's a bit of advice. The best way to try to convince someone of something is to try to have them come to the conclusion. And if we ourselves come to a conclusion, it is much easier to accept than just having it drilled into you. It says, yeah, I'm smart enough to come to this conclusion, not man, I'm stupid. The point of this all being is that when I'm force-fed lines like this,
家畜家畜どいつもこいつもいい顔をしておる搾取されるだけの豚どもめ市民どもの税金で飲む酒はうまいの
the anime is treating me like an idiot who needs to be told what these villains are. Having all the rich guys just automatically look as a stereotypical depiction of rich guys, and always having them say predictable and generic things just forces their character. Let me ask you a question. What makes the evil villain that, a kid would typically create bad? The one with the evil mustache and a tall black chair stroking a cat, and most of the time names himself along the lines of Dr. Evil or the Dark Hand. Why don't these characters make us look into ourselves and see our own faults, the danger of greed, hate, etc.? Basically, why doesn't this character have depth and is thought-provoking? I know the answer. Which is that we know that this type of character is so illogical and so far-fetched. Furthermore, why did we come to that conclusion? The answer to this is that we can't relate to him, not necessarily in a sympathetic way, which can be affected when used properly, but rather we don't see it as rational to ours or the show's reality. A small mustache man with a cat in an underground base where he teaches sharks to jump through hoops is something we can't relate to and identify with, which is the case here for these generic evil rich guys. And for the large number of them they had absolutely no relatability and absolutely no subtlety. This also ties into motivation. We can all relate to someone who wants to be successful, which could be a good jumping off point for an evil rich guy, and so on. But as for Akame got killed, there are no logical thought progressions. There is no relatability or believability to these villains at all. No human traits that we can relate to. These rich guys are some of the worst I have ever seen. There's no subtlety, there's no relatability, there's nothing to distinguish them from characters other than evil rich guys, and absolutely no motivation. And lastly, they had absolutely no depth and well thought out thought put into them whatsoever. These guys are so bad that if you gave them a mustache, a monocle, and a black cat, that I would think that they were written by a 6-year-old. Another archetype of the show loves to copy and paste, so much in fact that several of the villains seem like exactly the same character, is this evil guy who just loves justice and acts like a complete psychopath about it. Now if you watch my past videos, you know that I like it when a villain thinks they are right, because basically we think we are right. The anime tries to use this idea, but definitely completely misses the point to it, which is to have subtlety and relatability to the characters. Relatability as we also want to see what we see as right done, and subtlety because it makes us question if they are good or bad, and in turn makes us come to the conclusion ourselves. But as for this anime, they completely miss these points. Doesn't this just look like the face of subtlety to you? Or perhaps the subtlety of just giving one of the villains no pupils for no reason? Or maybe it was the time they put a gun in one of the villains' mouth. Wasn't that ridiculous enough? I'm sure Michael Bay would be really proud of that. Writers, having the villain scream justice over and over again like a psychopath kind of defeats the point of subtlety. From the gun mouth, the screaming justice, and the "I'm obviously the bad guy" face, you completely missed subtlety. Not to mention with these villains, yet again, they had absolutely no well-defined motivation. And yet again, it makes it seem like all their actions are coming off just because the writers said so. Because admittedly, they did try, and it suffers from the same problems as the protagonist's backstories. They're glanced over, too much exposition, they're poorly constructed, they don't give a proper response to the question why. For example, this one girl hates Night Raid because they killed her mentor and father. But did they show us why she loved them? And why we should see this as a logical cause and effect? Nope, absolutely not. It's just because the half-baked parents are killed, fill in the blanks. This combined with the lack of subtlety makes her and other characters that act exactly the same as her being completely flat, forced, and completely lacking of any depth. The next archetype is a person who just loves killing people, because, again, they are evil and lack more subtlety and logical thought progress and development. Why aren't I just copying and pasting, because they're all the exact same problems here. No motivation, or it's glanced over, they never show why they act. There are no definable traits to separate them from their generic cutout character, or even any of the other characters of the show. And you can always easily tell that they're bad without using any brain particles. And no thought went into them, just like all the rest of the villains I explained. The last villain I want to talk about is, yes, I will finish sometime this year. Go get some popcorn or something. Is Ides, or Ides? That villain being Ides. Eldes? Idesu? There's two different... Ides? Which one is it? Whatever. She's one of the only villains who I actually think was wasted potential. Basically, they tried to develop a one-sided romance, and to be fair, it did have some good interactions and some likability to her character, but it still has way too many problems for me to put it up on a pedestal. Like, it is pretty glanced over and unjustified, and there's not much work put into it. And her backstory, while I did appreciate that it wasn't 100% exposition, which you won't believe how happy that made me, is kind of typical the survival of the fittest, strong kill of the week, just because backstory, blah 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 blah. And it's too short and you can't get connected to the people involved, and it didn't show much as why she would run a romance, and it definitely didn't justify her character since she's basically still in the let's kill everyone because of evil category. But again, it wasn't all that bad. I mean, it didn't feel forced, and it did fit in with the timing of the episode, and it was one of the few backstories I actually remember. I guess I was kind of hoping for a Yunogasai type character who doesn't really have proper logically sound reasons but still has relatability and great interest. But whatever is only half-baked and is a decent attempt, but it was at least somewhat interesting, I suppose. But she did lack motivation and depth, and I guess it's better than just saying I hated her entirely. Now, even with this giant train wreck, I have to admit there were a couple villains that I did think that they were on the right direction with. Like Wave, Bolt, and This is just because they didn't fall into the ways that the others did. They have more complexity to them rather than just evil, and relatability as well, such as wanting to change the kingdom from the inside or actually having a wife they love. Now, they don't save much because they barely have any screen time devoted to them, or they just didn't even feel like they were actual villains who opposed the protagonist. Most of the time devoted to them just felt like they were there, or they were just there to fight the protagonist, and they really didn't have a strong identity to them. I never really got like a strong sense of their character. But I think that's more of a fault of the anime's moderation of screen time rather than just bad writing. But a few "you're going in the right direction" villain type characters don't save you from a humongous flood of awful villains. Now before I go on, I kinda get the feeling that I'll be accused of overanalyzing the villains and searching for nitpicks. But the difference here is that the villains played a major role in the overarching story. It's not like in Attack on Titan, where they didn't really have a major role and were somewhat in the background. Here, the whole show is basically about assassinating evil people and fighting the capital controlled by evil people and so on. Akame ga Kill's villains always played a major part in the story and need to be treated as such. But man, do they fail hard. There wasn't a single one of them I can just really point to and say, yeah, that was a great character. Overall, they lacked motivation for their actions, they lacked subtlety for believability and complex characters, and they lacked definable character traits, which resulted in us having a lacked interest in them. The villains played a huge part in almost every episode and had a large amount of screen time put to them. And they are honestly just as important to the central premise, if not more than the main characters. And unfortunately, they're a complete fail. Moving on to the plot, which also has major problems. Elements such as timing and backstory and exposition dumps are also huge problems here. And most of the time the plot is really uninteresting, especially in the early episodes. With most of the plots just being Night Raid goes and kills poorly written villains and well that's it. It didn't feel like there was an overarching link connecting the rebels fighting against the capital. It just felt like some background matter, despite being a major point of the show. It won't keep you guessing and it doesn't really do anything that is unique. The only thing I really enjoyed was the action, which was fast-paced and did at least keep my interest. Sure, the characters had as much depth as a potato, but at least the action somewhat kept my interest. It wasn't amazing, and you definitely shouldn't watch the show for the action. But it was the only reason I wasn't constantly begging for the episodes to end. Now, there is one other part the plot kind of gets right, which they did create some effective death scenes, which did felt dark and serious. And they really could have been tragic and meaningful, well, if the characters that they were happening to were actual three-dimensional characters. But since the characters are so flat and lifeless, any emotion that the scenes could have are pretty much nullified and forgotten. Which is another reason why the poor characters just hurt this anime so much. Overall, the plot isn't anything special, it didn't have any great interest or really anything that'll keep you guessing. There was one thing going around in my mind when I was thinking up this review. And that was that people might tell me that this isn't meant to be a super deep show. And that that's an excuse for the lackluster characters, but rather this is just some dumb fun action anime. And while I can't agree on that on a purely critical sense, this type of thing has helped me enjoy the action of just some shows, even with the problems it may have had. The first thing that comes to mind with this is probably Gurren Lagann, and perhaps High School of the Dead. And even though I haven't seen it, Black Lagoon probably fits in this category really well. As for Gurren Lagann, it did have poor villains and a lackluster plot, but the amazing protagonist and the completely over-the-top action easily made up for it. While this didn't fix the problems of the show critically, it did completely help keep my interest in the show, and really help with the enjoyment levels. Did Gurren Lagann have flaws? Yes, but the positives easily overshadow the negatives. While it didn't fix the flaws, it did keep me really invested in the show, and help divert my attention away from the flaws. As for Akame ga Kill, there's really nothing to grab onto. Heck, you can't even enjoy it in It's so bad it's good way just because it's unique. Like I have said numerous times, characters are the most important part of any story. And while the characters in Gurren Lagann were extremely well written, the characters here are extremely bland. So with my list of things I didn't like, or just flat out hated, was there really anything I actually liked? And admittedly, yes. Much to my surprise, the ending was really good, even to the point where it felt like a completely different writer took up the script. The 3 last episodes were really good since they did have very good interactions and emotions in them, even if it did to a lesser extent suffer from the problems of the past points. For example, the 3rd to last episode did have a quick backstory and it wasn't all that defining, but it really did have some really good interactions which did help define the character somewhat, and as a result I did kind of like the character of Akame's little sister. These last episodes had some really great genuine interactions, strong emotion, and they kept my investment and gave me a reason to care. And the last 2 episodes are really the only episodes that I think that the anime actually nailed. And if the characters had actually been well written, like they were supposed to, I could easily call this a great anime ending. And like I've been saying repeatedly, there was a lot of good genuine interactions with the characters, which did give me a reason to actually relate to them. And they didn't feel like they were on a death grab with the exposition crutch in such ways as the plot and the characters. My favorite scene of this is one of the last scenes, which is one of the members of Night Raid just walking through the town, as they see some of their friends asking them to join them. This scene had such good atmosphere that I vividly remember it. It showed just the emotion of the character without even saying anything. Next, the action was much more gripping compared to the rest of the anime. And the whole struggle itself felt like there was this brilliant battle that you didn't know how it will end, with the strong use of the word that we call epic. The Emperor was kind of a good villain. I mean, they did give relatability to him, not wanting to be seen as the weak link, even if they didn't show his motivation as to why he feels this way. But at least he wasn't generic and completely forced. Furthermore, the results of this battle felt catastrophic. I mean, you have the threat of citizens dying all over and just, well, pretty much the threat of everyone dying. The plot was good and engaging and unpredictable, with some great twists and turns I didn't see coming. Overall, it is everything I like in a nice good ending to a good anime. But the problem here is I can't see Akame ga Kill as a good anime, despite the pleasing ending. It has just way too many problems at the foundation of its story. There were only 2 episodes that I thought were enjoyable, and only 2 episodes that I would actually call good. And all of this is out of an anime with 24 episodes. And the good ending is definitely not worth sitting through the rest of the anime. The characters who were the most important part of the anime were completely flat and bland, with not any thought or depth put into them whatsoever. The villains were absolutely gut-wrenchingly awful, feeling fake and unreal. They had no depth, no subtlety, no motivation, and were pretty much there because the writers said so. They pretty much contained everything you need to make a villain really bad. Not to mention, what makes the characters and villains even worse is there are way too many to keep track of. And with no defining traits, you'll have to take notes to even remember who they are. And with these 2 things in mind, this makes the cast one of the most forgettable casts in all of anime. Next, the plot didn't know how to be unique and interesting most of the time. It used forced exposition to completely destroy any attempt at character development through backstories that were so basic and flat that I can't even remember most of them. While the ending was pretty good, the show has way too many faults in so many different ways that I can't see any reason for me to recommend it, or not to call it a very bad and disappointing anime. Whoa, let's do this, it's end slate, here we go, gotta make this fast because this video is long enough and I don't want to edit for the next 2 years. Anyway, reviews, here we go! We have the Fruit of Grisaya review, not the Fruits of Grisaya, because you know I'd never make a small little mispronunciation. Oh, I never do that. And then next up we have the Hitalia Axis Powers review, and I also have the Hummingbird and my Twitter account, links in the description, because YouTube has this little thing where it doesn't like Twitter links, or Hummingbird links. By the way, you actually sat through that whole review? Wow, you must be quite the trooper, aren't you? I hope this editing doesn't kill me.
You seem to always be deep in thought. Tell me something. What do you think